Now we are going to go back to our plan for a final town hall meeting, a free-flowing discussion where we tap into the expertise and the experience of some of the people you've already seen up here, some others as well, and we want it to be free-flowing, so we want absolutely everybody to feel they are going to have an opportunity to chip in to this conversation that we are about to have. The very broad theme for this is simply, how do we define victory for Ukraine? What will represent victory for Ukraine? It's both simple and yet probably is going to lead to quite a complicated discussion where we may find some disagreement. So let us see. The idea is that Zanny and I have the microphones, but we really are looking to tap into everybody here and your thoughts at the end of what has been an amazing, compelling 2 days of discussion and analysis. So, Zanny, if you want to kick off by deciding who we want to hear from.
I think the less we speak, the better. So I'm going to kick first. Timothy Snyder, why don't we start with you? If you could all keep your interventions reasonably brief, we can do a good job of getting as many voices as possible. That would be great. Over to you.
Okay. So when I think about defining victory, I'm tempted to give big metaphysical answers, as I think many of us are. But the victory that allows the big metaphysical answers is the military victory. And when I look back at the last year and a half, I have to ask myself, who were the realists? Who started talking about victory first? Who learned from whom to talk about victory? I heard the phrase "peremoha" in Ukrainian on the third day of the war. I then spent about the better part of a year trying to persuade people to say that word in English. In that sense, peremoha means victory. In that sense, the Ukrainians have been the realists the entire way, because the only way to end this war is by way of a military victory. So I think that the crucial thing is to start from that and to ask ourselves, we in the West, how much of our way of thinking about this war has been a result of a Russian psyop having to do with nuclear escalation? How much of our way of thinking about this war has had to do with a legally inadequate notion of self-defense, in which for some reason we think that the Ukrainians can only fight in Ukraine, which is a little bit like rooting for a soccer team, but saying that it can't pass the ball over the half line, or rooting for a boxer and imagining he can only defend himself but can never throw a punch, because if he threw a punch, that would be escalation and we'd all be shocked. How much of the way that we've thought about this war has been strategically unrealistic? If we think about victory, which is the only adequate conception, we have to think about the Kerch Bridge in the water and Crimea returning to Ukraine. Even if that were not morally and legally correct, that is logistically the only way to get to victory. So after a year and a half of giving like my nice philosophical answers about victory, I wanted to start this conversation by giving that narrow, but I think necessary for any other conception of victory answer. There has to be a military victory, and we in the West have to ask ourselves at this moment, what is it that we got wrong, that we weren't using that word earlier, and what is it that we're getting wrong, that we're not thinking decisively about what we need to do? Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. Radek Sikorsky, I can see you on our front row too, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this now. We'll get a microphone to you. There you go.
Well, in answering the question, what is the definition of victory, I completely agree with General Budanov and with Tim. That's easy. Ukraine recovering its territory and being paid compensation. But I think the definition of a draw or defeat is also interesting. So a defeat would be if the current line of contact were frozen. Ukraine would be losing territory. But such a defeat for Ukraine is also a defeat for Russia, because Russia would not have realized its original war objectives. A draw whereby Ukraine recovers what Russia conquered since 2014, but not everything, is also a kind of victory for Ukraine, because Ukraine is going to be a member of NATO and of the EU. We all recognize that Ukraine deserves this through its valor, and it wasn't guaranteed before. So I actually don't see how Russia can win this, and Ukraine gets something out of all three scenarios. And of course, we're hoping for the best.
Yeah. Just on a point that Zanny raised with Budanov, where does Putin fit into this? In your view, is it inevitable that Putin will not be the leader of a Russia that emerges from this war? In other words, if we are defining victory for Ukraine, does it have to include an end to Vladimir Putin's rule?
I think it does, because if I were to guess, Putin thinks he can survive as leader of Russia on top of a bad war, but he couldn't survive a bad peace. So he has an incentive to continue this, even when it's against Russia's interest. This is an overall problem, that Putin's interest and Russia's don't coincide anymore. Russia's interest is to be an ally of the West to protect its Far East. Putin's interest is to stay in power. Yeah. And therefore, I repeat that this war will probably be ended by a different team. And what I would have asked General Budanov is what signs we should look for the increasing brittleness of the Russian regime. And given the Prigozhin mutiny, where is the challenge to Putin likely to come from? What kind of person is likely to terminate Putin with extreme prejudice?
Well, we better call him back. Where is he? No, I think he's gone. Okay.
Shall we get another historian's perspective? Neil Ferguson, what is your take on the definition of victory? Do you agree with the previous speakers, and how do you see that?
Of course, the definition that we've heard this afternoon is correct. And as Tim Snyder just said, victory must mean the return to Ukraine of its territory that's been illegally occupied. But the question is, how do you get there? And what I've learned over the last 36 hours is that the mood of the fighting men and women, the people at the sharp end, is less euphoric than it was 12 months ago. And so we must ask ourselves, we who have the privilege of arriving, staying in a luxury hotel, doing nothing more dangerous than hold a microphone, and back we go to comforts far from the front line. We must ask ourselves, what can we do to sustain those who are laying down their lives and suffering grievous injury? We can't simply leave saying, victory is recapturing all that territory, see you next year, good luck. That's not a responsible position to take. If we have any purpose, any function, we applied historians must say, well, what do you do to get there? It seems to me that we should recognize what Ukraine has already won, the victories that's already been won. You humiliated Russia, exposed the limits of its military power, put to rest the notion that it's still a superpower. One victory. Second victory, you clearly won the right to EU membership and NATO membership. Even Henry Kissinger, the arch-realist, acknowledged that earlier this year. But the third and most important victory is the one that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. You've transformed Ukraine's reputation. When I first came to this conference, which was nearly 12 years ago, Ukraine's reputation was a country with the morals of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Today, it's the land of heroes. There hasn't been a bigger transformation in the reputation of a country in my lifetime. All of this has been won. How do you keep this? A year ago, I gave some advice to one of President Zelensky's advisors. you need to be fighting while talking. It's a line from the Vietnam War. But it was the North Vietnamese who said it. The most important thing for Ukraine is be North Vietnam, not South Vietnam. You're going to have to talk. I'm impressed by what we heard earlier today. You've already achieved diplomatically. You are changing minds. Alexander made this very clear. It's a hugely impressive thing. The diplomatic work must continue at the same time as the military work. There are paths to peace. China is not convinced that it has made a good decision in backing Putin. The weakest point of Vladimir Putin's reign is not the front line with Ukraine, it's behind him. So I want to urge you, in pursuit of this ultimate victory, the nature of which I think we all agree on, you must use guile, diplomatic guile, to build an isolation of Russia until ultimately those fighting men, the people who are risking their lives, get not just fine words, but they get an end in sight. The land may not return this year or next year. It may take years for that ultimate victory to be achieved. But as I said yesterday, and this is the last thing I'll say, Ukraine can begin the work of reconstruction and economic recovery now. If Larry Fink is on the line, let's start investing today, immediately. Let's not wait for some remote peace. Let's begin the reconstruction now, just as it was possible to rebuild South Korea while there was a mere armistice and a large demilitarized zone and an incredibly dangerous neighbor right next door, which, by the way, is still there. So that's the best an applied historian can do. If it gives any encouragement at all to the people fighting this war, it is that more unlikely victories have been achieved in history than Ukraine's victory over Russia will be. So have hope.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Neil.
I'd like the microphone to go to the lady at the back there. We've had a lot of very eloquent men. I think it's about time we hear from some extremely eloquent women.
Thanks, Laura. My name is Lisa Jasko. I'm a member of Ukraine Parliament. And when we talk about the victory, of course, the first thing is about it getting back the territory. But I'm dreaming also that we are working every day on the new international order of international organizations that really work. I'm dreaming that they will be functional, not dysfunctional. I'm dreaming that there will be tools that can really protect democracy and peace. Of course, I'm talking about United Nations. Of course, I'm talking about Council of Europe, other organizations, including NATO. We know that Ukraine now gave an existential push for this organization to become functional. But we need the resolutions that will be respected and that will really work. And I dream, and this is what we shall be discussing, that Russia, when it falls into different states or pieces, or will stay as it is, but the new Russia will respect that international law. This will be a real victory, and it will mean that we fought for the rules, humanity, and morality that will work for the future of peace. Thank you.
Ma'am, you had your hand up. We'll go to you now. Then I'm going to plant a thought with you all, which you may or may not appreciate.
Thank you. I'm Alina Polyakova. I'm the CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis in Washington. And I wanted to go back to what Tim just said about why have we not, as the collective West, committed to a vision of victory for Ukraine when Ukrainians have committed to that vision. And one of the big obstacles I see in our capitals, in Washington, Berlin, and elsewhere, is that victory for Ukraine also means defeat for Russia. And there's a profound fear of that among many in the policy community. Thank you. And I think we have to really start to change the narrative on this, and it behooves all of us to do that, because one, defeat for Russia isn't analogous to defeat for Germany in World War I, which is what many people allude to. It's analogous to the fall of the Soviet Union, when we saw the greatest wave of freedom, liberty, and democratization in the world's history, frankly. This is the right analogy. And the other analogy that we have to, I think, debunk, or the idea we have to debunk, is that Russia's defeat will mean nuclear war, right? World War III, because we don't want loose nukes. This is the 1990s all over again. And Russia has existed and probably will continue to exist just fine without Ukraine and without its occupation of Crimea and other parts of Ukraine. But these narratives I find are so powerful that the other side of Ukraine's victory is Russia's defeat, and that profound fear is something we all have to work to overcome. And I think that obstacle is one of the great obstacles to answer part of Tim's question as to why we haven't committed to Ukraine's victory in the West.
Okay. I just want to, you know, my day job is presenting this show, Hard Talk, on the BBC, which from time to time means that I have to take devil's advocate positions that maybe I don't always actually truly believe in altogether myself, but nonetheless, to test an argument, they're important to air, and I feel like kind of doing that now. Is there nobody in Ukraine or amongst the strong supporters of Ukraine, as I think it's safe to say we all are in this room, who is prepared to say or prepared to contemplate believing that there could be a victory for Ukraine that did not return every single inch of occupied territory? I ask this partly because you will all have seen not so very long ago a senior NATO official air an idea about offering Ukraine full NATO membership on the basis of a compromise deal which would see some limited territorial concession to Russia. He was blown out of the water. I'm sure he regrets doing it. But I'm just asking an open-ended question.
There are
right, okay.
Okay,
well,
lots of questions. Let's go with the gentleman there in the second row briefly to answer that.
Thank you very much. I'm Professor Harany, and I represent the poll of Democratic Initiatives Foundations, which we did in July for Opora Network. So, in different polls, there are from 5 to 10% of Ukrainians who would still consider it as a victory if some part of Ukrainian territory will remain under Russian control, either Crimea or part of the occupied Donbass. So there are such people. But we live in a democratic country, you know, with different views. But you know pretty well that majority of Ukrainians deny it. And majority of Ukrainians do not agree to lose the way to Euro-Atlantic integration. So we asked Ukrainians, what do they mean as a victory? 43%, and there was only one choice. 43% said full territorial integrity of Ukraine, clear. Additional 26% said full defeat of Russian army / uprising in Russia / disintegration of Russia. So it's very radical position. And the answers to this question increased. So there is a radicalization in Ukrainian viewpoint recounts that. More Russian atrocities, more radicalization of Ukrainians. And finally, we put provocative question. What would happen if NATO diminish or stop support to Ukraine? And again, majority of Ukrainians said we need to continue to fight. I don't know how realistic it is, but most Ukrainians are ready to do that. So what we need weapons, real sanctions, you know, which would work.
Thank you.
Ma'am.
Thank you. Frankly, even that is not enough to be considered a victory when Ukraine is whole and free. All Ukrainian children have to be returned to Ukraine. All Russian children have to study at school the aggression their country was part of, Holodomor and all occupations in between. That will be victory. And I really don't get how people, after discoveries in Bucha and elsewhere, in deoccupied territories, can speak about territories. It's never territories, it's people. It's people being tortured, deported, killed. So I'm sorry, even if there are some people in this room who are politically more realistic than Kissinger, I hope they will not speak up, because I think our Ukrainian friends don't deserve that.
Yeah.
What about, shall we have the gentleman there in the third row with the white shirt? Right there, yes.
Thank you. I think that we have a linguistics problem here. To be frank, we're talking about victory as returning Ukraine to its borders of 1991, but we never changed our borders. We should push Russia back to its borders of 1991. Now, if you think about it in that perspective, what it changes is that if you don't do that, you are legalizing a land grab. That means that one day, Belarus might push and change unilaterally, deliberately, its borders in Poland. And then someone would go out and say, would you agree to the fact that you would just be fine with it in exchange of something? So this is a very peculiar question, but it changes a lot if you think of it in a different perspective. It's not about returning Ukraine. Again, we never changed our borders. It's about pushing Russia back to its borders, because it was Russia that deliberately and unilaterally changed it. And now the question with South Korea, as it was rather subtly proposed to us here, has one simple problem. In keeping the regime in North Korea and exchanging this regime for economic development, what has happened is that now in North Korea you have a regime that threatens not just South Korea, but the whole world with the nuclear weapon. Now, in my opinion, the true peace and the true victory will be when Ukrainians and the countries that borders with Ukraine and Russia will feel themselves safe. And with Putin in power, I don't think it's possible. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, Michael Gala, we'd like to hear from you, MEP.
Yes, as we all agree on the territorial aspects, and as this notion what victory means has already been enlarged by President Kaljurand, saying that all people who have been deported must be free back in Ukraine. I would like to broaden it further, and that is, it has been alluded to, this is this institutional victory. And then it comes not only a victory for Ukraine, but for us in EU and in NATO. I think when Ukraine is on the path towards full membership in NATO and EU, that is already the victory for Ukraine. And once they are in, I think it will be an enrichment and not a burden for us. So a victory, an institutional victory for us. And then I think, moreover, when we look also globally, I think we speak of a systemic victory. We need to prove that the area of freedom and democracy, the Western world, that we are victorious in this systemic fight. That it is something for the rest of the world to note, that once Ukraine has regained its territory, is in EU and NATO, and we have proven that the forces of freedom are stronger than the forces of evil, that is something to last and to bring this victory to even broader notion. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's turn to this side of the room. Ambassador, you've been very patient. Right here at the front.
Thank you very much. And Stephen, with respect to your question, I think the question of territory is really not central to the question of victory. Ukraine is in an existential fight against an imperialist and genocidal power. The last time we were in that kind of fight was World War II. And that ended when we thought we ended the ideology of imperialism and this genocidal mentality. And I think when we look at the Ukraine situation today, the only victory is when we actually defeat the ideology of imperialism and genocide that Russia has right now and Russia tries to justify. And I think, as Alina said and others said, the reason we're not doing it is because we're not appreciating that that's what we're in. The Western response is defined really by fear, as Alina said. We're afraid of Putin, we're afraid of nuclear weapons, we're afraid of our own soldiers getting into a battle, we're afraid of our own domestic politics. And instead, we need to recognize that Ukraine has the resolve and the moral case, and that the West is far more powerful than Russia in every measure that we can think of. And if we can overcome our fears, we can get to that victory.
So that job then is for people for people like you, Kurt, to win the argument in the United States of America, which, you know, one could argue right now you're not doing with a vast swathe of the American public, and indeed a vast swathe of the Republican Party. Yeah, just quickly, yeah.
No, I think what we face in the United States, and I would put it on all of our political leadership, is a unwillingness to lead. We don't see either major Republican figures grasping this and saying we need to do this. Neither do we see the president making the case to the American people. The polling data shows that most Americans support Ukraine. They are concerned about the costs and how long it will take, but that is a reservoir of potential support that can be tapped into if we had the political leadership willing to do it.
Thank you. Could you just hand the microphone to your right? Yes, right behind you. Thank you.
Just a brief comment. For me, the Ukrainian victory will be when, unlike in South Korea, for almost 67 years, there are US troops on the territory of South Korea. I don't want to have US troops on the territory of Ukraine. I want Ukrainian army to be able to deter Russia, and that means Ukraine is part of NATO, but it also means that 40 billion of investments are here. Over the whole of Ukraine's history of independent state, Ukraine attracted 40 billion investments over 30 years. We need 40 billion the next year Ukraine wins, and this is something we all have to prepare. So when we compare Ukraine to South Korea, an armistice, let's not forget what was put in place in order to ensure that victory.
Right to the right, yes, there's a gentleman there. Thank you.
Thank you. I do think that Ukrainian voices have to be heard, and I'd like to cite an interview from President Zelensky. It has not been given enough attention, and perhaps ask Deputy and Party Leader Arakhamia to comment on it. It is, I think, let me read it first. It says, "If we are on the administrative border of Crimea, I believe that it is possible to politically push for the demilitarization of Russians on the territory. I think that would be better." That, I believe, is a statement of an interim objective. And I think as much as we've heard very important totalist expressions, I think we should also understand that there may be a long path towards the full recovery of Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial and otherwise. And I was just curious if perhaps Mr. Arakhamia could explain it. I'll read the quote in Ukrainian as well.
If we are at the administrative border with Crimea, I believe that we will politically pressurize for demilitarization of Russia in the territory of Ukraine.
To respond to that.
Yeah, I think that we have to distinguish two terms. One is full victory, one is acceptable solution for starting the recovery process and all of that. And full victory for everyone, as the gentleman said, that in the polls. So politicians can make any kind of choices, but in Ukraine especially, whatever choice you make, you have to adopt this to the general public's opinion, right? And general public is right now is very radical, and they will not accept any kind of solution, interim solution. So the victory has only one sense now in the Ukraine for people on the street is liberate territories fully, return our people, return our prisoners, return our kids, and not lift the sanctions for that. This is important, and especially important, which is important for Russians, they want to somehow lose the criminal cases in the ICC against them, and this is not acceptable as well. So like, even if you imagine that we somehow managed to get an agreement and leave the territories, lifting the responsibility for all the crimes they did is not acceptable for Ukrainians. Thanks.
Thank you. And Andrei Zagorodnik, is Andrei here?
The back.
Ah, good. Let's get a microphone to Andrei.
Yes, I know there's a lot of people from analytical community here, and I just wanted to add one little addition into the formula of the victory of Ukraine. We shouldn't forget that, well, obviously Black Sea is a key for independence, for security, and so on and so on, and obviously we need to get rid of any violent acts in the Black Sea. And I don't think that current Russian government can do that. So I just wanted to bring the idea and kind of plant it in your brain that in 1856 there's been already a solution to this, which was called Paris Agreement, which prohibited Russia to have the Black Sea Fleet. And the reason was for that was based because Russia couldn't behave itself in the Black Sea. They couldn't bring any stability, they couldn't bring anything. And unfortunately, with the current Russian government, that's the case. So until Russia is having a Black Sea fleet working in the Black Sea, able to disrupt the freedom of navigation, they will do that. I don't think that they're able to bring up any constructive work and any constructive relations to the other countries. So I'm afraid that until we first of all, destroy the Black Sea with the military means, and secondly, prohibit them to bring more ships there, we're not going to see a freedom of navigation. And it may sound radical, and I know it is, but think about the better scenario. There isn't any. Thank you.
Yeah, all right. Thank you very much. Well, Ivana, and then we'll go that way.
Thank you. Maybe, I think it's logical that Ukrainians have this maximalistic approach towards how we see our way of survival. Because in order to have the future, in order to have the choice, we do have to survive. And the only way to survive is actually to get back to the borders of 1991 and hopefully have the restoration of the international law. We know how idealistic it sounds. But at the same time, I think we all have to work additionally to ensure that Russia is isolated and is weakened to that extent that it cannot wage another war. But I totally agree with Alina. We are not there yet. We do not agree on, we have transferred from Ukraine cannot lose to Ukraine must win, but we are not there yet that Russia has to be defeated. And this notion has to be a shared notion of everybody. But I want to pose one question. What is the cost of Ukraine losing? We are defining the whole idealistic or non-idealistic of what is the Ukrainian victory. But can we, as the whole world, not only us Ukrainians, can we bear the consequences of Ukraine losing, of Ukraine disappearing, of Ukraine being, just gray zone? I think we cannot bear the consequences for the secure future peace, neither in Europe or in the world.
Okay. Right, we've got a forest of hands. Let's try and get a few voices from over here. Yep, you, sir, and then there's two women behind you.
We also only got 5 to 10 minutes, less than that now. So
I'll be brief.
Be brief.
I think that we still need to look at people, and as we were, writing this report on trauma, I would get back there. I think that Ukraine will win when, few years after the end of this conflict, every child will have someone who will take care of him or her. Every war veteran will feel welcomed. When people will have free will, whether they want to stay with their family here or in other parts of the world, and this will be the victory. Because we don't know yet where the border between free world and not free world will be, maybe in 10 years, but we can do everything we can to make this company, this society, inclusive, helping, kind, and loving. And I think if Ukraine will live for something and stop living against something, that will be the victory.
Okay. Well said. There are two women who should give us your views now, ladies, one after the other, and then we're going to be close to the end, and there's a couple of speakers at the front we'd like to hear from as well, but you go for it right now.
Yeah, it's Jessica Berlin. I'm an analyst from Germany and the US. The name of this conference was "The Future is Being Decided in Ukraine." So the definition of victory in Ukraine or defeat will define the future of the world. Over the last 17 years, I've lived in Afghanistan, China, Myanmar, Rwanda. Every country I've lived in, also including Germany, the UK, and the US, has seen backsliding of human rights, of democracy, of a perspective for a future. If Ukraine doesn't win, to refer to that question about the cost of defeat, you can forget it for the people all across the world who are fighting for freedom, who are fighting for their rights, who are trying to build a future for themselves, they will have the rug pulled under them, because if the Western world, with all our wealth and military might, are not able to support Ukraine in this fight on our very doorstep in the heart of Europe, then every dictator on the planet knows that we will not lift a finger to help people fighting for their rights in Tehran, in Yangon, in Taiwan, wherever. So the stakes could not be higher.
Thank you.
My name is Halina Yanchenko. I'm a member of Parliament of Ukraine, and I just arrived from Stanford a couple days ago. And I want to share some ideas from there.
Briefly, if you would.
Briefly. Point number one, it's not just a war between Ukraine and Russia, it's a war between civilization. We all understand that. It's a war between democracy and dictatorship. And that's why Ukraine has support of US, Europe, and Russia has support of Iran and North Korea and countries like that. Second point is, it's not just the biggest battlefield in Ukraine now, it's the biggest scene. People around the globe are watching what is going on in Ukraine and who is winning. And it really affects democracy all over the world. We see some swinging democracy in Europe, in Germany, in Spain, in Italy, where not a democratic political forces are kind of gaining support because they see that democratic countries are kind of reluctant helping Ukraine. And this is the second point, and now we come to consequences about what is the definition of victory. And I want to address all our international friends and allies who are present here. It's very important to stay with Ukraine, not only until the victory on the battlefield, but also on the reconstruction of Ukraine, because people around the globe will continue watching what is going on in Ukraine. And will Ukraine become a failed state like Iraq or some other examples where allies have left after the finish of the battlefield? Or will it be a real successful case with reconstruction, with investment, with future, with innovations? And that's why I really want to ask all of you to be with Ukraine until the very last day, not on the battlefield, but the day of our reconstruction. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Let's bring it back to the front row. Congressman Costa, you've been listening to many Ukrainian voices telling the world it needs to understand this is a fight for the world. And with Kurt Volker, I was discussing how America is really going to get this message, because right now it doesn't seem to be breaking through in the United States. What's your view on how you're going to go from this conference and persuade Americans of the strength of this argument?
Well, I think we've really come about a military strategy that if the West is all in, the United States and Europe, will ultimately provide the victory that we're talking about here today. But a year ago, I talked about the need of a strategy, a political strategy that would provide the political will to ensure that we could provide the military support to get there. We've heard a number of definitions from the town hall this evening of what we define victory to be, and I think it's not mutually exclusive on what that victory and how that victory could be achieved over a time period that involves stages to restore the entire territorial integrity of the country of Ukraine. But Ukraine's a long ways from the United States. So when you talk about constituents that I talk to, and you have to make the case every day why this is important to them, what I find most effective for my constituents, which is kind of a moderate constituency, it's not liberal, it's not real conservative, it's kind of in between, is first of all, this is about good and evil. People understand that. When you look at the atrocities, and I would add, among the other factors besides bringing the children back, ultimately there has to be a tribune held for those who have committed the war crimes during this war. That must not go left undone for those perpetrators of those war crimes. I called President Putin last year a war criminal after seeing the sights of Bucha, and I was sanctioned by the Kremlin within days afterwards. I wear that like a badge of honor. I'm not planning on going to Moscow anytime soon. But the fact of the matter is, many of my colleagues are ambivalent. It's not a secret that there's a lot of division in the United States. We have elections coming up next year. We have elections in Europe next year. And so the political will, I believe, is the bottom line to creating the necessary support to achieve the victory that we all believe must be achieved. And why? Because this is not Afghanistan, this is not Iraq. This is truly the test of our time. I said that last year. Historians 5, 10, 20 years from now will write the history as to whether or not when we were tested, when it was our time to be there, to determine whether or not the values of democratic nations that are reflected by human rights, by freedoms that we cherish, of speech, of religion, to innovate, to be risk takers, to be entrepreneurs, to have a rules-based economy. That's what this is all about. And we as politicians, we as the members of the press, through your talk shows, through your media, we, and Victor, I want to commend, last year you held this a year ago in the middle of the start of the war, and we're back here again because it shows to the world the resiliency of the Ukrainian people and their will to stand up for their sovereignty and for their democracy. And this is our time, and if not now, then when are we going to, as democratic nations, stand together in Europe and in the United States and throughout the free world and stand with Ukraine? The future is being decided today in Ukraine, and that's why this is the bottom line. We have to be in here together to ensure the political will to provide the necessary support to ensure victory. That's what we are doing.
I'm not sure we can add to that, Stephen. I think that's been a remarkable series of comments. I know so many more of you want to offer your comments, but I fear I'm going to get into trouble from Victor here. I've been trying to get Victor to offer us his definition of victory, and he refuses to. So I'm going to leave it with that, Congressman, and those remarkable voices that we have heard. I have no doubt, whatever your definition of victory, and the minimalist one is the territorial one, there are beyond that the kind of country Ukraine has already become, is becoming. In important ways, I think you have already achieved victory, but I have no doubt that the full victory will be there. Absolutely no doubt after what is now 6 days here. I don't know about you, Stephen. I know that however hard this road is, however long it takes, the commitment of the Ukrainian people and the bravery and the determination to do it is absolutely there. So whatever your definition, wherever, and there were slight nuances here, you are united in being determined to achieve it. And with that, we should stand in awe.
I quite agree. I had one thought, which is I had the privilege, as I think you did too, of meeting a group of young leaders, young Ukrainian leaders, and they were asking me what my impressions were of Ukraine 18 months into the war. And I said to them, I had the great fortune to be born in the 1960s in the United Kingdom. I have never had the experience of living through a war on my homeland, in my homeland, having my own family, my own country invaded by a brutal occupying force. I said, I look at you, I look at your determination, your courage, and your absolute conviction in this fight and your ability to win this fight, and I feel nothing but admiration. And that was the young Ukrainians, many of whom I imagine will be facing a period actually fighting in this war. I found it extraordinary, I found it moving, and I think that's why Ukraine will win, and that's why the world will owe so much to Ukraine in the future. I think Zanny and I are done, but we are not going to close the conference. I would invite you, President Kaljulaid, and